And everybody I kind of fielded that to was like, that is the worst idea that you could possibly have. That's terrible. Nobody wants that. And I was like, yeah, but I'm going to do it anyway.
This is not a business where you take polls. It's a business where you think. You're not right or wrong because 1,000 people agree with you.
Per dimostrare che 2 più 2 fa 4.
Eric, great to have you on the pod, man. Thanks for coming on.
Dude, absolutely. Thanks, guys, for having me.
Yeah, it was like we were just talking. It's great spending time with you and the crew up in Ogden, Utah last week. Nate Fisher spoke. We had a great time at the new Christendom Press Conference, inaugural conference, right? You guys plan to do more of these?
Yeah, it was interesting because we were like, I don't know if we'll do more. It was a lot of work. And then pretty much everybody requested another one. So we're like, okay, well, I guess this was the first inaugural of many that we will have,
I have it,
in Ogden, Utah.
I have it on good authority that if you do another one, you will get twice as much interest.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many people, in group chats saying, "Oh, I couldn't make it this time," or "Yeah, if I go back again next year, I'll bring my entire extended family and relatives."
We heard a lot of that, and so we've already kind of been looking at different venues. We kind of cap out. Oh, we found out on the Sunday service we cap out at about 450. I thought the cap out was 300, but there were definitely 450 people that made it in there. So, but yeah, I think probably next year, bigger venue too, as well.
Yeah. A little squished in there.
Yes.
Yeah, nice. Well, so good segue into the broader topic today that we wanted to get into with you. So you guys are effectively building a new city or building a new community to take over a city. And you're doing this with a couple of other guys who are building a church alongside this, a school, Christian businesses. They're really kind of economic sovereignty across the board. I wanted to just jump into Ogden. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how the project of building Ogden, Utah started, and we can go from there.
Yeah,
that's mostly for people who are unfamiliar with what exactly it is that you guys are doing on the ground level there.
Yeah. So interestingly enough, the church several years ago, Pastor Dan Burkholder, they were here, part of a Calvary Chapel church, kind of mainline, big evangelical type church. Somewhere along the line that they got in the kind of CRAC, Doug Wilson circles. I believe they attended a couple of Grace Agendas. Saw psalm singing front and center, said, hey, we really like this. We like what's going on. Slowly started reading some of Doug's theology and getting into things like postmillennialism, theonomy. And just through that process, they slowly started reforming the church. It's been about 5 years, I think, 5 or 6 years since that process began. And, if you look at the pictures of the church from then to now, completely different people. Obviously they're trying to lead the church in that direction. We end up with some positions like, again, postmillennialism. We have Presbyterianism now in the mix as well. So yeah, a lot of things have changed in the church. But fundamentally they were just saying, look, we have this vision for bringing Christendom to Ogden, Utah. A lot of the stuff that we had seen in the church, I grew up in Acts 29 and other stuff, young, restless, and reformed. We were really given a brand of Christianity that I would call churchianity, meaning the only mission of God in the world was really ecclesiological. It was really just within the walls of the church. So if you had high cap guys in your church, all they were trying to do is compete to be the pastor and then maybe go plant a church or, go on a mission trip, something like that. Well, fast forward, we get into this, Christendom 2.0 ideology, and we're essentially saying, no, wait a minute, Christendom is all of life, right? All of life for all of Christ. The businesses that you run are part of Christendom as well, your schools, everything in the Christian community. So really what started happening in Ogden was Brian and Dan partnered with Kevin Love, who's the headmaster of St. Brennan's Christian Classical Academy. So they started a school. Brian started doing psalm singing with the music. Obviously started preaching in a very particular way to the building of Christendom. And then I think the other tier was kind of what you mentioned was economic. Right, bringing in guys who are saying, yeah, actually, I want my business to be fuel for this new Christendom, bringing our communities no longer under, Globo Homo or kind of the big conservative Inc., but saying like, we actually want to envision a world in which Christ is Lord over every sphere. And so we just slowly started putting those pieces together. We're about three years deep here into that project. And, we've got 1,000 years. So we're just getting started.
Yeah, that's awesome. So 3 years into the project, Brian and Dan were already there in Ogden prior to this. Long time guys. Okay. How did you get plugged into this project? Because I know you were not from Ogden originally.
Yeah, that's right. So they had been here for a while. They were here while it was still Calvary. They had gone through kind of the personal transformation. I was pastoring a CREC church in Colorado. It was a small town. We were kind of dependent on oil and gas. Many people will be familiar with this. Administration changes brought the death of a lot of small rural oil and gas communities. So kind of as that happened, Trump and then pre and post Trump, really, those communities were kind of dwindling. So, when I got there, we were probably 50 people church, and then it kind of slowly dwindled down. People are moving out of those areas because of the economic reasons. So we ended up in Grand Junction, Colorado. And then kind of from there, we were saying like, okay, what's next? What is our next step going to be? I had talked to Michael Foster from It's Good to Be a Man. And Michael said, well, this crazy thing, you should start a podcast and you should get involved with Twitter. So I started the Hard Men podcast, got involved on Twitter, and actually met Brian and Dan through that. And eventually Dan and I talked, and Dan was like, hey, you should come check out Ogden, kind of see what we're doing. I would say, too, the other thing with them was they were one of the only churches I knew of that stayed open during COVID. And so 2020 was very pivotal in this. I just noticed, I was like, hey, they stayed open. I want to talk to them and figure out why that was. And then just slowly after that, we visited, got to know the people, and said, I think we could be under the same yoke here and push the plow in the same direction. So we eventually, about a year and a half ago, we moved here to join in the pastoral work and then to start New Christendom Press as well.
Okay, sweet. So Foster was the one that pushed you to start the podcast.
Impetus.
Yes, Michael Foster. Well, there's kind of two things. So at the conference, we had Toby Sumter, and I got the chance to tell him and his wife this, but I said, years ago in Bloomington, we were at a pastor's conference, and Michael Foster was there. So he and I were talking, and he's saying, you start a podcast. And Toby gives like 3 messages on masculinity. And it was really those 3 messages where I said, I want to kind of fire a missive with the Hard Men podcast. I want to start a podcast on masculinity. It was one of the first times I'd ever heard a pastor talk about effeminacy as a sin. And I was like, wow, I was really intrigued by this. Started the podcast. So obviously at the conference, it was cool too, because Toby was saying, he's like, yeah, my oldest son has been listening to the Hard Men podcast. He's really been getting into this. So I had to share that story with him. Everything kind of comes full circle. And awesome. A lot of men kind of just encouraging me along the way to do that. And that's how I ended up here.
That's cool. Why did Michael encourage you to start a podcast? Was there anything in particular about your background that made sense for like a launching pad for a podcast?
Yeah, I think a big part of it was, okay, so 2 things, pastoring together. Michael and I were doing some pastoral work together in Indiana. So kind of got to know each other that way. The other part of it was, so my background, I worked in the firearms industry. So for a number of years, worked for NRA, National Rifle Association, doing their publication side, did a lot of digital media with them. I also worked for Guns and Ammo magazine. So that was a bulk of my career. Prior to that, news, editorial journalism, and sports journalism. So I had the media background. I'd been running websites for a number of years. Just really as Michael and I got to talking about it, he was like, you seem to have kind of a passion for masculinity and biblical sexuality. And I think you could have the media tools to be able to do that. We need more of that in our space. And so he was just kind of giving me some pointers and saying like, here's how I think you can win in the space. This is before It's Good to Be a Man had really taken off, obviously before the book with Canon Press. But Michael and I too, I think both of us just kind of were recognizing something Toby and Doug had talked about for a long time, which was that the church was retreating on the issue of biblical sexuality. And so we were like, yeah, I actually don't like that. I think we have a strong biblical case to be made here. And the more I looked at it, I thought, okay, this is really where the culture is seeding the ground. When you looked at, obviously the sexual issues today are front and center, but maybe like the OOs they weren't maybe quite as much. Doug and others were talking about it, Doug Wilson. And even me at the time, I was like, I don't know, man, this Doug, he seems a little crazy. I don't know, maybe he's wrong. And then, he writes a book eventually about it, like a sex robot. And I'm like, okay, he's lost his mind. And then it all comes true. And then I was like, okay, no, I think he's onto something. And so, yeah, we just said, hey, we're gonna push the plow forward. We think this is a huge issue. A lot of people told me, hey, if you start a podcast, you're going to get canceled. And
so did you start it while working for Guns and Ammo or one of these?
I was working for the NRA, and it was an interesting situation. I think it never caused a problem, but I think it eventually would have. As with most conservative spaces, the NRA is very, very conservative. But it's one of those areas where like biblical sexuality is the idol of the day. You can't go after the LGBT trans community like anybody. Nobody can touch that. So yeah, I eventually saw I had been pastoring too. I guess that's the other part of this. So I was working these jobs in the gun industry while pastoring. And so I just kind of said, well, somebody's got to do this work. It's not for everybody, but somebody has to be speaking boldly on these issues. And certainly we need more people within the church to do it. So I just kind of said, full send. I'm going to do that. And probably not going to have a job forever in the industry, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Go
ahead.
I was just going to say, what was that journey like going from 0 to 1 with the podcast? You just had that conversation with Foster and said, I'm going to start it. And then you just jumped in and started recording. How long did it take before you got traction? How did that begin?
Please give us tips.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, a lot of it, honestly. So there's a lot of providence involved. So I got a job with the NRA. I started in March of 2020. I flew to Washington, D.C. They're based out of Fairfax, Virginia. I flew there. And while I was there, they shut everything down. Okay. So I'm flying out of Dulles, going back home, and there's like the weirdest Twilight Zone scene in my life. Like 3 people in Dulles Airport. It's one of the busiest airports in America. And I'm flying out of there, and I'm like, I have a 777 style plane all to myself. I'm like, this is really weird.
Crazy.
So I fly home. I'm like ecstatic because I just got this job. I had just finished my pastoring run. Okay, great. I got this job. I land back in Colorado. A day, maybe, the NRA calls me and they're like, hey, economy shut down. Our main business is NRA show and fundraising. We're furloughing like 2/3 of our staff, and you just got hired, so you're one of them. And I was like, you got to be kidding me. I thought I just landed. I'm settled. It was an extremely disruptive season for me and my family. We had come back to Colorado. I was living with my in-laws. And my in-laws are wonderful people, but always hard to live living in the same house with your in-laws. So it's just this tumultuous time. Nobody knows what's going on with COVID. They're telling us it's like the DARPA people are like, oh, it's the Spanish flu. Everybody's going to die within, minutes of contact, whatever. So you don't know what's going to happen. So I'm furloughed. I'm in like month 2 of furlough. Don't know when I'm coming back, if I'm coming back ever. And I had been talking to some people, Michael Foster included. Another friend called me out of the blue and was like, I've seen some posts on masculinity. I think you should do a podcast. I finally start the podcast. It was interesting, though, because, even the input I was getting was like, hey, look, people have a short attention span. They don't want long, in-depth things. Make it quick, make it short, make it snappy, whatever. Keep people's attention. And so I was like, yeah, so I think what I'm going to do is like 45-minute to an hour-long monologues like I would preach on masculinity. And everybody I kind of fielded that to was like, that is the worst idea that you could possibly have. That's terrible. Nobody wants that. And I was like, yeah, but I'm going to do it anyway. So I started this. I started a Patreon channel almost immediately. I think in the first 3 months, I had like $100 on Patreon. And I was like, okay, this is stupid. I don't know what I'm doing, but I don't know. There's something about it where, I knew from content creation and media, you have to have quality content delivered over time. You have to be consistent with that. And I was like, okay, just trust the process, give it 6 months and see what happens. I would say probably the 4th or 5th month is when it really took off. I did an episode somewhere in there on complementarianism and patriarchy. Because the thing is, too, as you're producing content, you don't know what's going to stick.
Right.
You're kind of
Yeah,
throwing
exactly.
spaghetti at the wall. And so really the consistency and then watching metrics and saying like, okay, what of the things that I really believe in is going to stick?
And at this point,
Complementarianism,
you're still just monologuing. This is not guests yet.
all monologue.
Impressive.
Okay.
All monologue. So I'm doing all monologue. I hit the complementarianism, patriarchy segment. That one took off. That was kind of the first thing to really take off. And because nobody was talking back then, this is the thing people don't remember. No one was talking about biblical patriarchy. I mean, maybe Doug, but that wasn't mainstream by any stretch of the imagination. So I started doing that. I think it's 6 months. I hit like $1,500 a month on Patreon, and I kind of realized I think maybe something here. There's something here. And then I think the other thing was just kind of realizing like the impact it was having on people when I would get pastors saying like, I'm going to change the way I preach because of this, or, we want to invite you to our conference or whatever it was. I think that was really when I started realizing this is a really big issue. It's a really big need for the church. And, I think we can continue to make this, a viable thing.
And you started at the same time, you said Twitter. Did you go you logged in one day, you were 0 followers, little egg picture. I don't know if it was like pictures at the time, but
yes. So when I started, I was actually, I went back recently and deleted all my original Twitter. And I know people are like, what was it? Racist? What was it? No, my Twitter in the beginning was like, I was an avid Broncos fan, and I would I still am, but I would post like, it's so cringe now because it was like, I can't believe how bad Peyton Manning is. We need a new quarterback. Like stupid takes. So
positive world takes.
Yeah, positive world takes. I look back now on the last 7 years of being a Broncos fan. I'm like, you don't even know how good you had it, man. You should have just been grateful. So yeah, I'd been posting that. I think when I talked to Foster, I had like 300 followers. And again, it's very much like spaghetti on the wall. You're trying to figure out like what works for you and your brand on Twitter. To this day, I can go on Twitter and post about sports. Nobody cares. And I have, I don't know, I think I'm almost 17.5 thousand followers or something like that. What I figured out was say true things, speak the taboo, and talk about biblical sexuality. And that's kind of been the long, slow growth process. Now, I'll say this too, like, it took me forever to get to 5,000. It took me forever to get to 8,000. So this is like, we're talking like in 3 years, I finally made it to 17.5. And really what happened is you get bigger, like your Twitter it'll just take off on its own. There's been a couple viral tweets in there. The biggest was like the yoga pants modesty thing. I think that was like 17.3 million or something like that. I had one about hair length. Oddly enough, just quote Paul and you get yourself in a lot of trouble. But it was interesting because Scott Pressler, he's like a conservative vote getter, Republican Party vote getter. I quote Paul, it's a shame for men to have super long hair. And he was like, no, it's not a shame. In fact, I have really long hair and I feel attacked. And I was like, it kind of looks effeminate, the photo that was posted. So I looked the guy up. Sure enough, he's like an outspoken homosexual. And I was like, my case is rested. I believe I have proved my point. So anyway, just speaking the taboo, speaking things that I actually believe. A lot of times people ask me like, why do you punch people in the face so much on Twitter? I think part of it is like, that's what Twitter is. Yeah, Twitter is just like, I'm not really trying to be a shock jock, but Twitter is just kind of one of those places where it's like, I actually like that about it. It's kind of confrontational. People say it like it is. Early on, that was Facebook, but Facebook is like old man photos of your family now. Like if you want to have the discussion, the agora, it's on Twitter. That would be my, 5-cent take that I probably stole from Santiago somewhere along the way.
And I probably stole it from Nate. Did you at the time, at this time, are you thinking about how to cash in this media momentum that you have? Not in terms of just, making money, but like, where does this all lead? What do you do with this signal that is reaching tons of people. I mean, how many guys, what's been your journey in terms of downloads and listeners on the podcast?
Yeah, it's been really interesting because in the beginning, this is kind of the thing about starting some successful businesses. I've also started some that are complete failures, and any entrepreneur is going to have that story. But really, when I began, the thing was I believed in the message so much that I was like, this has to get out. And the thing was, it wasn't. I didn't have like a cookie cutter. I didn't know how Patreon was going to work. I didn't have anybody who was telling me, hey, this is going to be successful. It's going to turn into movement. It's going to bring you to church. And here's how it all works out. In the beginning, it was just me saying, I believe in the message. I just believe in this message. I believe we need it. One of the things I talked about at the conference, I was actually reading Stonewall Jackson's biography. And Jackson is this guy who stands on the battlefield. Everyone else is in full retreat. And I saw the church doing that with sexual issues, just full retreat, blow the trumpet, full retreat. We're cooked. We're done. And I was like, I read Jackson. I was like, I think I'm going to attack. I think I'm actually going to aim my guns at the center of their line. And I'm like full bayonet charge. And there were so many people who were like, are you insane? You're going to destroy your career. Like, this is going to destroy everything. And I was like, yeah, but here's the deal. I kind of don't care. I believe in it. And somebody has to be brave. Somebody has to be courageous. And so I kept moving forward with it. I asked myself the same question, like, what's the viability of a business? Like, here I am, like, sinking my career in the gun world while this thing is like growing. And okay, $1,500, that's great. But like, that's not exactly like a livelihood, Where does this end? So honestly, the message for me was I just kept being faithful with it. I kept plugging forward, kept networking, kept connecting with people. Foster again would tell me things like, hey, your network is your net worth, man. Just keep connecting with people. Don't lose heart in the project. You believe in it. Keep networking, keep producing great content. As that went on, I met Dan and Brian. Again, I came out here, talked with Dan and Brian, and they were like, hey, we think there's a place for you pastorally at the church here. We really like what you're saying. We agree with the messaging. We think there's a place pastorally to be a part of this work, this community. But also, that was when we started talking about New Christendom Press. We didn't call it that yet at the time, but we said, what if, I told the guys, what if we did a podcast with the three of us? I don't even know what it would be about, but what if we did a podcast like that? And it would be King's Hall. Eventually that's what that became, which is really like the flagship main signal beacon air war thing that we're saying, like, this is what we're about, theological maximalism and post-millennialism and all this great stuff. So we started doing that. To answer the other question about downloads, I started Hardman Podcast, and I was kind of blown away because I didn't know anything about downloads or podcasts, but within the first like month and a half, I was like, I don't know. I don't think I'm doing very well, but I'm getting like 1,500 downloads an episode. I don't think that's very good, but who knows? Then I start looking up numbers, talking to other people, and they're like, actually, that's actually not bad for somebody who just started a podcast. Fast forward, most of the shows now do between, I would say, usually between 55,000 downloads a month plus. Sometimes they get into the 80s. Depends on your month. Depends on what shows you do, but generally speaking, it's like, once you get into that 50K plus, especially 25K plus, you get into like, it's a lot easier to monetize, a lot easier to have advertisers, pay for that stuff. So yeah, most of our shows now, like, we've kind of got the formula down where you can, like, we started Haunted Cosmos, and you can get a show to like $4,000 a month on Patreon pretty quick, like 2 months, because you've already built a network, right? You've already got momentum and that sort of thing. That's pretty easy. 50,000 downloads. Keep in mind, a lot of our shows are like twice a month. So to be at 50K, you're talking 25 for general episodes, stuff like that. Obviously, you got old cataloged episodes that you're doing pretty well with that as well. But yeah, I mean, I had no idea where it was going to go. Just kind of stayed faithful with it and kind of rode that wave, and here we are.
That's amazing. So are the pastors, are you all there at Refuge Church bivocational, and would the second vocation be podcasters?
Yeah, so we've actually had a lot of discussion about this because it was something that was really hard to figure out for us. Originally, I was the CEO, and like, okay, Eric, your main job is run this media company, and really, what we shifted in large part because I was spending about 60% of my time, even at the height of everything we did last year, I spent about 60% of my time pastoring people. People in my parish, some preaching. That sort of thing. And we kind of came to the conclusion that we're pastors first. And really everything that works well for our podcast is when it is an overflow of our ministry to the church. So even as Hard Men Podcast has grown, it really, like, my best material comes from counseling young men, counseling young women, sitting in on marriage and family counseling. As I've listened to those, concerns and problems with people, that's kind of fueled what the content is, right? So we're getting people who come to our church, they say, I listen to Bright Hearth, I listen to Haunted Cosmos, I listen to Hard Man Podcast. I don't think I really understand patriarchy. Or maybe I do understand it, I think I do, but what do I do when I really actually don't want to do what my husband is encouraging me to do? Like, what do I do then? And so, like, we would develop content around that. So the way it is now, we are really primarily pastors, and the three of us particularly, and then the second, bivocational. It really ends up not feeling like bivocational, but just sort of overflow, because it's stuff we're already doing with church ministry. But the key focus, we've talked a lot to like Doug and Toby about this. Like, how do you balance this, right? You're doing a media company, but where's your focus? And we love those guys, so we basically try to copy.
Yeah. And so on that note, what's your take on your role as you have so many initiatives. You're building this Christian city, you're building a church, you're also CEO of a media company. Particularly as it relates to being a pastor in that role, like, how do you respond to people would say, well, if you're a pastor, you only have to preach to the people across from the pulpit. Anything external, any podcasting, any blogging, anything like that is a no-go. What's your take there?
Yeah, I think originally talking with like Brian Sauvé about this, Pastor Brian, we did look at a lot of the arguments. You can read Turretin and other people on like, what is a minister of the word? What should he be doing? Where should his time be devoted? So we've really wrestled with a lot of those issues. I think what we've fundamentally come back to, though, is that when you look even at the reformers, like, they filled a lot of roles. Martin Luther filled a lot of roles throughout his time, both as a priest, then pastor, then seminary professor, then book writer, then Bible translator, hymn writer, that sort of thing. I think one of the things that we run into is when you have a lot of guys who are high cap, high character guys, very highly competent, somebody like Pastor Brian, well, this guy can preach, he can write books, he can write music. So it's really hard to say to him, like, well, we only want you to do one of those things. When you're like, well, no, you're actually like really good at a lot of these. What we have had to do is just say, okay, here's each guy's role. Let's be really clear about that. And then let's just make sure that we are, compensating people fairly, that we are making sure that all the needs of the church align with the people we have. So, if Brian is going to be doing some of that stuff, then okay, like, who's the key guy on like overseeing, maybe counseling, maybe, kind of business operations side of the church, like who does what. We just have to be really clear on that. And I think as we've done that, it's been a pretty good deal. I think the main issue you have is, like, I went to seminary, but nobody gave you kind of the cookie cutter example of what a pastor should be. But then you start looking back at church history and you're like, I don't know, some of these guys were like fighting in Cromwell's army. Some of these guys they wore a lot of hats. And we're kind of in that early phase of building in Christendom 2.0, where it's like, you're just going to have a lot of high cap guys who do a lot of things well. And so I think that's kind of how we've parsed it out.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, that was a sense I got just being in Ogden last week with you guys, talking to both guys that are part of your community, but also a lot of the men that came from outside to the conference. And these are guys who are just productive. That's how I've described it fundamentally. they're not a one track guy, whether he's a pastor, whether this guy's a pastor or that guy's a business owner or a software engineer or whatever.
Yeah.
The kind of guy that will take to move the needle in a particular direction is not going to be a one track, well, that's not my job sort of guy. But hyper productive across multiple dimensions. At least that was a very, very strong sense. I was talking to Ben Garrett. I think he's a pastoral intern, and part of the production team of the King's Hall and the podcast. But he was telling me, I didn't realize his background was in repairing A10 Warthogs and being an engineer and doing this, doing that, and then getting laid off because of the mask mandate, and then immediately rolling into podcast development and production and editing and sound. And he's like, I don't have any background in that, but he just jumps right in. Kind of you'd expect an A10 repairman engineer to be able to do it. Very impressive. Just sort of the kind of men that are coming to around this signal.
Yeah, big time. I think a lot of it has to do with, we're pretty fortunate. We have the Air Force Base nearby. We got a lot of government contractors, typically tend to be pretty high cap guys. But this really goes back to when you're building a business. I'm a firm believer in this. Jim Collins and Good to Great, they talk about being the kind of guy that you are, you're getting the right people on the bus, right? If you can get the right people on the bus, then you may change roles over time. But we know these are fundamentally high capacity guys who can do a lot of things really well. And we know that we can essentially plug them in anywhere.
Yep. That makes sense. Quick question on the, so you mentioned Toby and Doug being influences, and they've been, obviously big proponents of building Christian community and of people taking a lot of the ideas that they've done in Moscow and expanding to other places. How has y'all's project been different from the Moscow project? I assume you've taken a lot of cues, but how is it? What differences have you seen in your project?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And honestly, a lot of it, we've asked that question a lot because I think it's basically a work in progress, trying to understand fully how we might be different. So essentially, like I said, we went up there, we kind of looked at what they were doing, more or less looked at the blueprint and then started building here. I would say in some ways, number one is they're 30 years into it, 30 plus years. So you have a lot more establishment of economic school, all that stuff. So I don't think we'll fully know for a while in terms of how was our unique personality and personalities shaping what we were building here. I would say the early reports that are coming back on that would be things we definitely want to be aggressive on the serrated edge cultural engagement. We may be, some of the I guess it's just things that are unique. Brian will talk about head coverings. I think Doug is usually, not going to talk about that. So maybe some small issues here or there. But for the most part, I think it's just, it's like you're the early tree that got planted. I think the other interesting thing that makes us different is honestly the context of Mormonism within Utah is just way different. So we have liberals, but to large part, what we're combating is even with the conference, I had people messaging me and they're like, hey, are we welcome to the conference if we're LDS Christians? And I was like, I don't know what to say to you people. First of all, that's just a different context, right? Than lefties at, Idaho that,
right
at the college campus who absolutely hate you. So I think sort of a lot of it is driven by the culture around you. Ogden is definitely a very it would be similar to Moscow in the very LGBT way, keep Moscow weird. I don't know if you guys had those movements up there, but we definitely have the keep Ogden weird, people dress like cats and furries and that sort of thing. So and then I think too the other thing that it probably makes us different is just again the prominence of Doug is pretty monumental. It shapes so much of their community. We're 2 years in, So it's like, I think people are starting to recognize, Pastor Brian and music projects and stuff like that. But, I think to some extent you have to be a little scrappier because you're not, dependent on your name, reputation. You don't have a long track record. People trust you, that sort of thing.
What about Ogden was, you think, strategic as you were looking at it from the outside, and guys are inviting you to come out and build a community and a church and a business and, this whole thing. As you look at it from afar, what things were you looking for to say, yeah, this is viable versus, no way?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, one of the texts I had been preaching on was in Ruth, and really Naomi's decision to leave Moab. And she's, regional famine. She's got all this family catastrophe. She says, call me Mara, I'm bitter. Kind of mirrored where my family was at that point. Like, we don't know what to do. Like, things have gone they've been really frustrating. We haven't made a lot of progress. And one of the things that Naomi did was she looked for the blessing. So she looks to Bethlehem, which is the house of bread, looks where God is blessing, where God's anointing is. Where has he lifted the famine? And it was in Bethlehem. So she goes there. So I think what we were really looking for throughout this process, where is God blessing? Where is God's favor upon the people? And we looked to Ogden and we're like, okay, clearly Pastor Brian, Pastor Dan, the two Kevins, the other pastors who are here, God is blessing them. I don't know why. At that time, couldn't really figure everything out, but God was clearly blessing it. So that was a big factor. And we said, okay, well, I want to go where the blessing is. I think we could put our shoulder into the work and see fruit. I think that was just a really key part of it for us. The other thing was the number of businessmen, I think, that were surrounding Ogden that I felt hopeful about it. One of the first guys I met with is one of the key people here in the church, real estate development, and he's got businesses, that sort of thing. And I just sat down with him and I was like, what's your vision, man? What do you want to do? And he's like, we want to retake Ogden for Christ. And he starts laying this out. And I was like, man, I'm pumped. Why wouldn't other people be pumped? Plus, the thing is, in like business and economics, when people build things, they're actually doing something culturally, right? They're not just like, great sermon, I'm going to go watch football all Sunday, all Saturday, whatever it is. These were guys who actually like, they had the splinters in their hands to show the proof for their work. And, just like a young woman, when you're looking at a guy and he's 18, you don't know fully what he's going to be, but you're like, okay, he's got the work ethic, he's faithful, and I think his trajectory is good. He's going somewhere positive, and I haven't seen a lot in the culture. So it was kind of like seeing that, being here a little bit, and saying, I think we can hitch our wagon to this and, plant our flag and be pretty successful.
Yeah, that's cool. And I'm curious. So you mentioned good to great earlier, getting the right people on the bus. Now in a business, you have a company, you can hire a particular kind of guy, you can screen for a particular kind of person to join the team. If they don't work out, you can fire them, they're gone. In a community, it's a little bit different. There's no at-will contract employment or anything like that. People can kind of come in and show up because they listen to your podcast or, they follow you on Twitter or whatever. So how do you guys think through continuing to build the community and this growth trajectory while maintaining or attracting a particular kind of family, a particular kind of group of people?
Yeah, I think part of this discussion goes to just general tribalism. Like when you build your tribe, you got to know that really it's like the 3-12, 120. So you got three guys at the center, kind of you have to be most particular about those three. They're going to drive the culture. They're going to drive the core principles. They are your core people. So I think making sure you get that right. For us, when we were coming here, it was like, okay, well, I'm going to be, I think I could be one of the three with Dan and Brian. And so that's kind of where I fit in. Now, when you're looking at the 72, the 12, the 120, you're looking at most tribes, like 120 is kind of like your core group of people. Dunbar's then you can say, number. Okay, well, yeah, Dunbar's number. You can say like, okay, well, this guy might be 119. So my expectations change. But I think one of the things we do, particularly for leadership, is we're extremely aggressive with vetting the perimeter and kind of like, who do we let in? Like, it is very difficult for any outsider to come into the community and like day one, you're like, oh, we're on the leadership team. We'd be like, no, you're not on the leadership team. That's not how that happens. So no, you can't hire and fire, but we probably do something that I think a lot of people would find very weird. People will call us and they will say, hey, I want to move to Ogden and I want to be a part of your church. And like Pastor Dan is like the master of this. He'll be like, here's 5 reasons it probably won't work. Here's why I think you would be turned off by us. And we're actually not in the like Big Eva mindset of like desperately clutching for as many people as we can, because we understand that potency is greater than numbers, right? And so again, just being very selective in your core group, I think is pivotal. Even when I was, talking with the guys, like we were all really clear with each other about, what do we want if you were to move here? Dan and Brian with me, they were like, move here, don't be a man, do what's best. There was no like begging and being like, oh, we'll change everything for you. There's like, here's our standards. If that's you, great. If not, see ya. That's generally, I think, like if you have a healthy group, you vet heavily for who's in and who's out.
Yeah, that's very interesting. What's been the growth in terms of numbers of the community since 3 years ago when you guys started this? You mentioned you were almost maxed out this past Sunday, but where are you guys at in terms of numbers?
Yeah, generally speaking, most Sundays, I think now we're at like 300 or a little over. Usually half or a little more are children. So kind of young families, competent, high cap young guys, which is really good. Young ladies as well. Yeah, generally speaking, I think when I got here, I want to say we were closer to 200 people. And a big factor in all of it was honestly the air war with the podcast. So we started that project because we thought it would be a healthy way for us as a core leadership team to talk through our principles and like get fired up about those core principles. Again, Jim Collins in multiple books will talk about, you need to continually revisit, like, what's our core principle? What's our key missional, our business plan? What are we aiming at? What's our vision? All that. You have to have these conversations continually. So we start the podcast, we do that. And it really changed what was going on. In the past, we would get people who would come into membership classes and they would be like, okay, so you're like a Bible church? And we'd be like, yeah, we believe in patriarchy. And they would be like, okay, let me see how fast I can run out of this building and spin the tires in my car getting out of the parking lot. Like, that's what was happening. Now what happens, we go through all the things. Here's why you probably wouldn't want to be here. Every single person in the room is like, yeah, I already know that. I've listened to every episode of every podcast. Like, that's why we're here. So that changes the dynamic. The power, Nate talks about this all the time, Nate Fisher, about the power of media, particularly media that is anti-regime and courageous right now. I would just go back and I would say, man, don't underestimate. If you're a good communicator and you can communicate your vision and values in a very, like, in a way that's magnetic for people, you can build a tribe. And we've kind of seen that. That's kind of led to the growth. Honestly, if we face any challenge right now, it's usually like most common thing we hear in the elder meeting, most common thing we talk with like Toby Sumter is, man, we're really growing too fast. How do we like guard this growth? Weeds are fast growth. Not all fast growth is good growth. So how do you protect the core culture? Those sorts of questions kind of are front in mind.
Yeah, well, if anything, real estate prices will keep
yes.
people away. Which Moscow, I know is seeing for sure. And I think you were saying at the conference that Ogden is not quite that expensive, but certainly certainly close to that kind of real estate market.
Yeah, it's not like if you were just going to pick a place on paper, that's kind of what's unique about Moscow and Ogden is the barrier to entry for people is actually kind of high. So when we moved to Ogden, we had actually looked at going to Moscow as well. And I'm a early starter entrepreneurial type. And so I was kind of intrigued by Ogden for that reason, just because it was like, I don't want something that's like super established. Like I want to kind of be the little kid with his hands in the concrete outside the building, be on the ground floor, that sort of thing. It's just my personality. But both places were like, it's very expensive to live there. Real estate's kind of limited. Here's what I think it actually works in your favor for, though. Like, you wouldn't pick these places. It makes it more of a filtering mechanism, right? Where people say, how in are you? Like, for us, real estate never made sense coming here. And we came from Colorado, which is expensive. But like, if you're in the Midwest, Moscow and Ogden don't make any sense. Like, yeah, I'd like to go pay double for my house. Why? So I have a view of the mountains. I could get a picture of the mountains and hang them in my house and then travel there once a year or twice a year, whatever it is. But again, I think it ends up being a filtering mechanism. And ultimately, look, God put these places where he did for a reason. He wanted to. I can see a lot of the benefits of Moscow, just like I can here. All the military people, you get, again, very high cap people. But I'm not sure anybody would have planned it that way. It just, we're just here and God blessed it. So we keep at it.
I mean, you're getting a lot of the principles that we see even in our business here near Founding, where we use media to cast a particular vision very explicitly in a specific direction that filters people out and tracks the right candidates, particularly on the talent side. And Josh can talk more about this. But then there's also the importance of some kind of mechanism. And again, Nate's talked about this, but some kind of mechanism that signifies skin in the game, a sign of courage, a sign of commitment.
Yes.
And there's, that you're not just a freeloader because it's, everybody, of course, wants to leave the burning buildings of California and Seattle. Anybody, well, you would think most people, but most sane people want to leave those places. But on the flip side, not a lot of people want to really commit to the jump that it takes to move from, a cheap place with terrible community in the Midwest to an expensive but great place like Ogden, or in our case, an amazing high-paying job in corporate America that is destroying your soul and hollowing you out as a person. Some people just don't have what it takes to make that jump for something that looks different, that's unique, that may not make logical sense on paper if you were to plot out your life and say, well, we start out in a place where it's real estate is cheap, then we, appreciate our assets and we go here. Sometimes I think we live in strange times where a lot of the moves that will move the needle, move the country in a particular direction, don't make sense on paper, and that's good.
Yeah. I think we see people on both sides of that spectrum of at New Founding. We see people. We put out a what is considered a pretty courageous message, a pretty specific line, and that attracts a lot of people. We get some people, like you're saying, Santiago, who are in a very, very good spot in the current system. They're in big name tech companies, or they're at the big name banks or law firms. And a lot of these guys are amazing. They're ready to go build other places. Every now and then we get someone who's like, I want all of what I have now, but it also to be, Christian and all these guys. And so, you say, okay, great. I got the perfect thing for you, but it's half the salary. And they're like, oh, I can't, so then you see that breakdown. On the flip side, I think when we lived in Moscow, there's some places where if someone shows up, with their knapsack on their back and they're like, oh, I don't care about money at all. I'm just here. You're like, okay, you should care about money because you need to feed your family as well.
Yes. Yeah, no, it's key. And I also think too, again, filtering mechanisms, but also what you end up with at the end result is basic facts. Like if you are going to make it in Ogden, you have to make pretty good money. So what does that tell you about the people? And even for us, sometimes in the Christian life, we're always faced with decisions where it's a little bit like going into the land where there's giants and you're like, this doesn't actually make sense on paper, but I see that God's blessing and I want to go where the blessing is. I guess we'll go. And it's weird how things have kind of worked out for us as well. Like when I left to move to a very expensive place, I had been pastoring for a number of years at $40K a year. Right. So I wasn't rolling in cash and oh yeah, I'm going to crush Ogden. But then, stuff started taking off. God was blessing. And it was honestly, most of that blessing came after we made the choice. It's right. You have to kind of take the leap and You definitely want to vet things and be strategic, but the thing about high cost of living places, generally speaking, there's also good economies around them. So like you go to Salt Lake and Ogden, and it's like you don't even realize that maybe we're on the brink of a recession when you're here, because you got Adobe and Facebook and Silicon Slopes over in Salt Lake and all the defense contractors, all that stuff. So it's like there's a lot of money too and a lot of career opportunity that goes along with high cost of living.
Yeah. How are you guys thinking about, you mentioned the economic factor in terms of building the church, but how are you approaching bringing in businesses, creating the jobs so that people can move there?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely front of mind, right? Because, no matter how good your church is, people have to have somewhere to work, right? So I think we've done a couple things. A lot of our people are either like former military or former government. And so they got into real estate development or small business. Small business and blue collar, especially post 2020, were really good opportunities to get out from under like big tech, big corporate, whatever. Like you go hang drywall for a company, like as long as you're sober and you show up on time, like they really don't care if you're jabbed or, who you voted for or whatever. So that's maybe a good place. And honestly, a lot of the trades, like here, if you're in plumbing, if you're in a lot of blue collar work, you can make very, very good money, especially if you're good at it. General contracting work, same deal. So we have kind of that front. I think the bigger thing, or I should say more like long-term stuff, is like, okay, how will we attract other businesses? How will we attract, we've talked about some things internally, particularly like engineering firms. I don't know what it is about this area, it's defense contractor world, but like everybody and their brother and sister and their nephew is an engineer. And so like there's some opportunities to branch out where you can not explicitly work for the government, but also do some really high quality work. So we're also trying to inject some white collar jobs in the area as well. So maybe some of our people within the community who could start that, I think would be really productive. Obviously on the media front, we continue to seek growth opportunity and expansion with New Christendom Press. So kind of trying to provide multiple fronts and kind of starting where we can. Some of it too is also dependent on like our local. We have a lot of people who are like, not even GED type guys who are part of the community. And so, you'll have them, and then you'll have, people who are very white collar engineers, doctors, etc. And we just try to carve out a space, I think, for each of them.
You've mentioned New Christendom Press a few times, which is another thing you guys are building. So you had the podcast, and you started building the city, the community, and now there's New Christendom Press. Tell us about what it is and the goal for it.
Yeah. So I'm the CEO of New Christendom Press. We started that really, again, we're, nothing original under the sun. We're like, okay, we're going to rip off Canon Press because these guys are great. So really just seeing the power of media. Again, even with you guys, American Reformer, looking at a lot of media projects, talking to Nate, saying like, this is really powerful. So we want to lean into it. We tried to utilize a couple different forms of media production. Cheap, easy overhead, low overhead stuff is like podcasting. It's amazing. A little bit of expertise. I taught myself how to edit. I, knew nothing beforehand. Even in the 2 years I've been doing it, like the program we're using to record now, the mics, everything is so much more simple than when I started, because post 2020, like everybody and their sister was starting a podcast. So we started doing that, saying, okay, we're going to get into this, then we're going to get into book writing. That has been a good process. It's a lot slower because you're like, you're pitching books, then you're signing people, and then you're waiting for manuscripts, and then a pretty quick production cycle, and then you go to press with it. So we've kind of stuck.
Did you buy printing equipment at this point, or are you working with some white label folks?
No, just using a lot of the self-publishing stuff. The thing about it is, I would wager most publishing presses would tell you this if they were being honest. It is so cheap, easy, and effective to use somebody like Amazon or another comparable player. that it almost makes no sense for you to have your own press and publish your own books in-house. The only thing that would be beneficial there is if you get canceled, right? So if they say we're not going to publish, the thing about Amazon though is there's still huge opportunity there. In terms of marketing, shipping, all those things, we've kind of taken the approach of like use those until they cancel you, and then use the canceling to boost your whatever else you're doing. But yeah, that stuff is so cost effective now that it's an easy way for people to get in the game, and I think that's probably, you know, kind of the world we'll start with.
You guys start a lot of things you have no experience in, which is pretty cool. And I heard you talk about this last week when I was there. You say, you know, you were saying something to the effect of you have to start sucking now so you do not suck later.
Yes.
I mean, is that generally, do a lot of the guys have, I mean, what's your own background? Did you grow up in a house where that was very productive, where you know, your father, your siblings were starting things from an early age? What drives this instinct for you and for the rest of the guys you work with?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think a lot of it is honestly just you're looking for the entrepreneur type, the starter guys who've run businesses. So in the past, you know, even being a pastor at a small church, you're kind of the guy. Like you are the staff. Working for media companies, I was editor-in-chief. I've been COO, chief of staff for media companies as well. And really what it is like when you're in a startup, you just have to, or you own your own business, which we've all kind of done. You pretty much just have to be the guy who's like, I don't know how to do this, but by tomorrow morning, I'll have it figured out. So I spent a lot of times in different businesses with other guys who were of the same mind and the same mold. And the thing is, like, you generally don't have the money to be like, oh yeah, we'll just pay somebody to do this. So you have to do it yourself. So I spent, 15 years of my corporate and small business life in that kind of mode. And so I think by the time we got here with Dan and Brian, we just said, yeah, we want to start a media company, zero experience in terms of, like, the thing is if you're at a big company, like I was at big companies, we got people for that, right? Like, you're not designing the website. Well, now you fast forward and you're like, okay, no, we're designing the website. We're the ones who have to figure out which servers we're using. So you can learn. I mean, that's kind of what we've figured out. You can learn, you can start stuff. Anything worth doing is worth doing badly. And that means in the beginning, like if you listen to the first episode of the Hard Men podcast, I listen to it now and I'm like, ugh, wow, that's rough. I had like $100 mic and my janky computer. You can hear the AC running in the background. I'm pretty sure like first episode, my mother-in-law was like, dinner's ready. Like you can hear that in the background too. And you know what? It's like, you got to start somewhere. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. So you just start. And then over time, like it's like any craft, like you become a master over time. Like now I can, we can produce really high quality podcast stuff in, an hour and edit it ourselves if we had to. And, we know how all the systems work. You can teach yourself, you can learn. So I think that's probably part of just like the small business owner, entrepreneur mindset, I think, that most of the guys here have, high cap guys.
That's cool. Michael Foster, again, it's funny now we're seeing a lot of cross-pollination across our guests. But Michael Foster, when he was on our podcast a couple of weeks ago, he talked about how communities and churches too, but communities in general take on the temperament of the lead guy or the lead guys. And so it seems like if you're this kind of guy, then you can attract other people to the core to take on certain, similar projects in the same mindset where it's like, well, we've not done this before, but we're happy to jump in, figure it out, suck along the way, eventually get it right. I mean, a couple of the guys there in Ogden were telling me that the Haunted Cosmos podcast, which is awesome, by the way, takes the longest to produce.
Oh yeah,
and in their estimation is the least useful. Can you talk a little about the haunted Cosmos podcast for people who may not be familiar with? I know it's newer, so I wanted you to talk about it.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. So a lot of the way that this came up was I remember some of the early planning meetings in board meetings, and originally like Ben and Brian were like, "Hey, there's this whole genre that is really huge that they had listened to, and it's like Fortean podcasts. Like Charles Fort was this guy who would go around and collect weird stories of the paranormal in the 20th century, I believe. And so they were like, that plus, they've been reading like Michael Heiser and sort of this, like,
Is Michael the Unseen Realm guy?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay,
Michael Heiser, the Unseen Realm. It's kind of an interesting cat because he's like kind of anti-reformed, anti-Calvinistic, but at the same time has some really interesting things to say about like giants and Nephilim and kind of like the spirit world according to scripture. So a lot of that is really interesting, really helpful. But basically these guys were like, yeah, I think we can kind of delve into this subject matter. And I got to be honest, like in the beginning, I was like, what nerd on planet Earth listens to this stuff? And they were like, no. It's really cool. You don't understand. And I was like, yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm not a believer in this genre. And they're like, no, like Bigfoot. And I was like, no. And they're like, okay, UFOs. And I was like, also no. Like that's what nerds listen to. So and then they told us, they were like, okay, we are listening to like what is the podcast? It's not Stranger Things, but there's a podcast that's like huge in this genre. So we were listening to that, and I was like, you guys are weird. What? Who? People listen to this? Whatever. And because here I am, I'm like, okay, I watch sports. I listen to sports. I'm very blue collar, not into the paranormal really at all. And history books, war, that sort of thing. So anyway, they tell us, they're like, okay, it's going to be audio production, sound production, whatever. I get episode 1 and 2 and 3. They start rolling in, but this is before they've been launched. And I'm listening to them, and I'm like slowly becoming addicted to these shows about like Mothman. And I was like, okay, I get it. So it was funny when the show really took off, and it's become like very quickly one of our best shows. I told the guys, I was like, I just want to say I knew from the beginning this was going to be great. I want to take credit for this. But yeah, they were consistent with it. And it's really in that genre, right, of like, the strange things, the paranormal, but also like when you read scripture, this is genuinely true. When you read scripture, there's a lot of weird stories. I remember hearing like Nate Wilson talk about magic. People are like, oh, we shouldn't believe in magic. He's like, I don't know, walking around Jericho, singing songs, breaking lanterns, seems kind of like a magic incantation. I don't know what to make of this very, very bizarre story, or the magicians in Egypt with Pharaoh. So yeah, just trying to unpack some of that. It's about what is the world that God made. And as they say, the world is not just stuff.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I highly recommend anyone listening to this to check out the Haunted Cosmos podcast. We'll put a link on the show notes. Eric, all these podcasts now, are they part of how do you guys organize them? Are they part of New Christendom Press, or is Hardman your own business? Is that separate? Like what's in, what's out in these categories?
Yeah, so they're all under the umbrella of New Christendom Press. They wouldn't, like, you could do it otherwise, but we kind of said, here's the thing about institutions have a unique opportunity and power to be a part of something that like lasting legacy. And so I think leaning into that, sort of pulling our resources and forces together for that reason. So all of it comes under. We kind of each obviously have our own shows that, you'll see people assigned to kind of key responsibilities. And then we track metrics and all that sort of thing. People get, basically you're going to reap the rewards for whatever your show does, that sort of thing. But yeah, all part of the same umbrella.
Nice. And but New Christendom Press is a press. So what kind of books or content are you guys looking to publish or launch in the next year or so?
Yeah, so there's a couple items. There's a couple in-house things that we have kind of on the back burner and working. One is a book on modesty. Brian and I kicked that idea around just because, well, modesty is sort of the hot topic, seems to be the thing that always goes viral on Twitter, but also just because I think it's such a big issue. People don't even think about that today because we're, 60 years after the beginning of the sexual revolution. And so, dressing inappropriately for both sexes is just like people don't even think about it. So probably do something on that front. We'd like to produce a King's Hall book and a Hardman podcast book. So King's Hall season 1, basically, a further distillation and crystallizing of our thoughts for building the new Christendom. And then the three that we have that are not in-house, Chris Wiley is doing a book on risk, Michael Foster on the death of a child, and then anti-feminism of the reformers from Zach Garris. So hopefully that'll keep us busy for sure for at least the next year, probably more.
Nice. Zach, he did Muscular Christianity, or
yeah. So Zach's a PCA guy. He's a PCA pastor. He did Masculine Christianity. Which, by the way, I had not known him. I met him through the podcast. He reached out and he was like, "Hey, I think you would really like this book. We say a lot of the same things." And he was being charitable. He says them a lot more like, I don't know, PCA eloquently. And so, yeah, I started reading his book. Phenomenal book. If anybody was looking for a defense of like why patriarchy and not complementarianism, or if you say, I don't know what either of those two things are, that book is really, really helpful. Zach goes through the historical side of feminism, going back to first wave, why first and second wave feminism were also very problematic. And then he traces complementarianism. Here's the problems. Here's the supporters, blah, blah, blah. So that's one of my favorite books, truly.
Okay, sweet. Yeah, we'll have to check it out. I've heard good things about it, and sort of in the space of Michael Foster's book. And even Senator Josh Hawley released a semi-adjacent book to this whole topic.
Oh, interesting.
Manhood, the forgotten. I think it's called the manhood, the forgotten virtue that America needs.
Interesting.
Josh Doss, if you're familiar with Josh.
Yeah.
You had Senator Hawley on his podcast 2 weeks ago or a week ago to talk about the book.
Interesting.
But so kind of coming full circle here to you guys you personally have you've learned to wield the sword of media faithfully to sort of shape and lead people in a particular direction. Looking back over your start on Twitter, start a podcast, and where you guys are at now, what things would you have done differently as you're thinking of how you use Twitter, how you use how do you do podcasting, how you wield those weapons? What lessons stand out to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the biggest one that I've talked a lot about recently, more with like just New Christendom Press in general, is really taking, it's funny because it's in the tagline of King's Hall podcast, but Festina Lente, make haste slowly. I think that we kind of, especially the first year of the company, we were trying to do a lot of things. And I think what we ended up doing was trying to fit 30 years of work into 5. And so there's been a lot of like burnout, a lot of overload. I think having to take a step back and say, look, like you look at Canon Press and Doug Wilson and Moscow, like, again, that's 30 years of work from a lot of people. And so like, we're not going to be there next year. And it would be very foolish to try to do that. So, I've had the opportunity to preach a couple times this year and have kind of addressed this in different sermons. So I preached on the Sabbath, the need for Sabbath rest and for the pace that God gives us. The other thing I preached on was Psalm 127. God gives to his beloved sleep. And so if you're always cutting at the margins of your days to get ahead, quote unquote, in your work, you're actually, a lot of times you're destroying your life, your longevity, and your legacy. So I think that would be one thing, is just being more paced. If I could do anything differently, it would be like, hey, this might take a long time, and you're not gonna, it's actually, despite what they tell you in, business school, it's actually hard to start a business. It takes a lot of toll. I was a part of 3 startups in 3 years. And I'm going to just go out and say I probably would not recommend that for anyone unless you are just sadistic.
Were you married? Did you have kids at the time already?
Oh yeah, this was like the last 3 years of my life, and like just ended. And I don't know, like you just end up at these points where you're like, your health is like, man, I don't know why I'm tired all the time, and the doctor's like listens to you and is like, you're an idiot. That's why you can't do that. You have to rest. And so I think that was a big part of it. We were all kind of collectively saying it is really noble to want to build Christendom, but you have to recognize that like the great cathedrals took 900 years to build, and we're not Methuselah. So that means that I'm going to have this one small part in this much larger work, and I have to be content with that. And I have to be, grateful in the work that I get to do, but there's only so far that we can push the ball forward. And so, yeah, I think just learning contentment, learning pace, that's kind of been the same with the guys in our community. It's, when you get a community of highly driven people, they always think the solution to every problem is more work. And that's often not the case. Sometimes you need to work smarter, not harder, that sort of thing. So we've like collectively been learning that lesson together.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, especially if you have the example that you're trying to follow, or not follow exactly, but a model like Moscow, Idaho, and what they're doing up there. It's easy, I think. There's a particular kind of person that sees an example of something they want to do. They want to be there at some point, and then they realize, wow, this is going to take a long time and a lot of work. Kind of like what Josh was saying earlier. I actually don't, and then they're like, I actually don't want, the idea is fun, but I actually don't want to do the work, or don't have the patience that it'll take to see some of this through. Maybe even your great grandchildren will reap the benefits. You won't see any of it. And then there are other people who say, oh yeah, that looks interesting. I'll do it. I can do that. And even if I only see 1% of it, as it grows and scales beyond your lifetime. Eric, we're coming to the end of our time here, but we want to ask you the two questions we ask all of our guests, the black pill question and the white pill question. So what's maybe in particular to your context, if it makes sense, that building Ogden, what's worse than most people realize maybe about building a city, building a media empire, reaching out to lots of people through Twitter and podcasts? What's the harder part, the black pill part of that?
Yeah, I think the black pill part is the number of obstacles aligned against you. When you start building a business or a church or a ministry or whatever it is, you start realizing like, wow, there's a lot of government loopholes. There's a lot of tax loopholes. There's a lot of, it's expensive and time consuming to get these things started. Okay, that's one front. But then I also think like societal forces, particularly if you want, like one of the bedrocks of our community is going to be biblical sexuality. I don't know if you noticed this, but the world's not really big on that right now. And it's the middle of June, so that feels appropriate. But I would say too, the biggest black pill thing for me in all of this has been the number of people within our own camp who will stab you in the back without thinking twice. It's always the people within the walls of Christendom who are letting the enemies in. It's always the people inside the camp who are saying, yeah, I know where to find Jesus. So I think that, if we have it a more resolved front, I think, it would be easier. But the reality is there's just not a lot of guys right now who want to fight and fight well for, you name it, post-mill, Christendom, culture building in our country, like whatever direction you're approaching that from. So I think there's just a lot of enemies in the camp, and that can be discouraging. I would probably put that close to the top of what's black pilly.
And what's the white pill building this?
Yeah, I think the ultimate white pill for me is in spite of all of that, our movement is growing. The number of people talking about patriarchy is growing. The number of people, it's kind of funny. I sort of learned this, not like I've learned a lot from Trump, but one of the things I learned in talking about all these things from Donald Trump was it's the way you phrase things in a very blue collar way. So people were like, why do you believe in post-mill? Why do you believe we're going to win? And finally, I just started saying, I was like, look, do you want a loser eschatology or do you want to be a winner? You want to be a loser or a winner? Okay. I want to be a winner. Let's be winners together. And surprisingly, that took on with a lot of people. So I was like, okay, the craziest guy in the room might actually know something. With that, I think there has been success and victory. I think that people like Doug got ignored by the mainstream for a long time while being right. And then so like we kind of are on this front where it's like post 2020 was one of the greatest things to happen in terms of waking people up. I've never in all my ministry or all my time seen people more open to a different way of looking at the world. So I think that's very hopeful. And I think that just the progress, like, you know, I talked about taking the long view, but we've also seen a lot of progress in a very short amount of time. And so I think that is really encouraging as well. And we're going to win. So the people who showed up from the conference, I was like, yeah, we're winning. I'm not worried about that.
Yeah, I mean, that was hilarious. Nate Fisher, COP Founding, opens at the conference. The first words out of his mouth are, GM, we're going to win.
Yes.
Very, very based, and probably a good place to stop. Eric, we are indeed going to win. Thank you so much, man, for coming on. It was great seeing you last week, and thank again Brian and Dan and the rest of the guys for having us out there. We had a lot of fun, and hope to see you guys again out there next year.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Certainly. We'll see you.
See ya.